The rain began on the 7th day of the 3rd month, and by the time I understood what it meant, my world had already ended. Was Agri Overseer 2nd Class Thomas Vrel, and I supervised the western grain sectors of Cultivation Zone Epsilon 9 on a planet whose name I will not speak, because speaking it gives weight to what we lost, makes real the absence where 43 million souls once lived and worked and died in the Emperor's service. The rain was grey. That's what I remember most clearly, more clearly than the screaming that came later, more clearly than the things that crawled up from the soil we'd tended for generations. Grey rain, falling in sheets so thick you couldn't see more than 30 meters in any direction, falling without pause, without variation in intensity, just a constant downpour that turned the fields to mud, and the mud to something else entirely. It started slowly enough that we didn't recognize it as an ending. The atmospheric warning systems detected the anomaly first. Particulate matter in the upper atmosphere, composition unknown, descent rate inconsistent with normal precipitation patterns. The tech priests were consulted. They performed their rituals, spoke their prayers to machine spirits that had monitored our weather for 2 centuries without error. The cogitators produced reports filled with data that meant nothing to anyone outside the Mechanicus, but the summary was clear enough, like unusual, but not unprecedented, likely the result of debris from the naval engagement that had occurred in high orbit 6 days prior. The Imperium had won that engagement. We'd watched the explosions blossom like flowers against the black, had offered prayers of gratitude that the enemy, we weren't told what enemy, never told, had been driven back. The rain was just fallout, atmospheric contamination. Unpleasant but manageable. We continued working. That's what you do on an agri-world. The tithes must be met. The Imperium requires grain, requires the endless tons of nutritional matter that feed the guard regiments and the hive cities and the millions of functionaries who keep the vast machinery of human civilization grinding forward. Rain or no rain, the harvest schedules remained fixed. I had 1,700 workers under my supervision, spread across 80 square kilometers of grain fields that stretched from the processing facility to the western horizon. Good workers, most of them, 3rd and 4th generation cultivators who knew the soil as intimately as they knew their own children's faces. They worked in the rain because I ordered them to work, because the alternative was failing to meet quota, and failure meant discipline from the administratum overseers who cared nothing for weather or difficulty or the grey slickness that made every surface treacherous. The first death happened on day 3 of the rain. Worker designate Callus, a man of 50, 2 years who'd never missed a shift in 3 decades of service. He collapsed in field sector 12, simply fell face forward into the mud while operating a harvest servitor. The medical team reached him within 8 minutes. I timed it, because timing everything was part of my function, part of how I maintained order across my zone. They found him dead. No visible injury. No obvious cause. The field medic reported cardiac failure, which was plausible enough for a man of his age engaged in physical labor. We burned the body according to regulations, scattered the ashes in the reclamation fields, assigned his duties to his eldest son. The work continued. 3 more workers died on day 4, 2 on day 5, 7 on day 6. The pattern was becoming undeniable, but patterns require interpretation, require someone with authority to acknowledge them and act. I reported the deaths to Zone Administrator Corvish, a woman who'd held her position through 4 overseers by being meticulously careful about what she chose to notice. She reviewed my reports, consulted the medical documentation, and issued a formal finding: environmental stress combined with inadequate conditioning. The workers were to receive supplemental nutrition packets and reduced shift lengths. The quotas remained unchanged. I implemented her orders because implementing orders was my function, and I told myself that the deaths were tragic but explainable. Statistical anomalies in a population of 1,700 engaged in dangerous labor. On day 7, the bodies started moving, not the fresh dead, those we'd burned, but the older graves in the workers' cemetery that adjoined cultivation zone Epsilon 9. The cemetery had been in use for nearly 2 centuries, holding perhaps 10,000 bodies in various states of decay. The graves began to rupture from below, the earth heaving upward and splitting, and what emerged was not the corpses we'd interred, but something that had been corpses, something that had been human flesh and bone, but which had been restructured, repurposed, transformed into organisms that existed only to kill. They were bipedal, roughly man-shaped, but their proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, joints bending in additional directions, skulls elongated and split to accommodate jaws that could unhinge like a snake's. They wore scraps of the burial shrouds we'd wrapped them in, rotting fabric that clung to bodies that no longer rotated in quite the right way. The first attack came at dawn on day 8, when the things that had been our dead fell upon the workers in Field Sector 3. I was in the administrative center when the Vox reports started coming through, voices screaming over each other, discipline collapsing into panic as people who'd spent their lives planting and harvesting tried to process the impossible sight of their ancestors, tearing them apart with claws that had once been human fingers. I activated the security teams, 43 armed enforcers equipped with autoguns and shock moles, trained to handle labor disputes and equipment theft, utterly unprepared for combat against enemies that shouldn't exist. They responded with admirable speed, reached Field Sector 3 within 12 minutes, and died within 3 minutes of engaging the enemy. The things were fast, inhumanly fast. They moved in coordinated patterns, flanking and overwhelming the enforcers before our people could establish proper firing positions. I watched it happen through the picked feeds, standing in the administrative center's security office, with Zone Administrator Corvish and 3 junior overseers, all of us silent as we witnessed the dismantling of everything we'd built. The creatures killed with terrible efficiency, their claws punching through flak armor as if it were paper, their jaws closing on throats and faces, dragging down our people and tearing them apart in ways that suggested hunger, but weren't quite hunger, weren't feeding so much as disassembly, systematic reduction of human bodies into component matter. When the last enforcer fell, the creatures turned their attention to the workers who'd been trying to flee. They caught them easily, killed some, left others wounded, bleeding, crawling through mud that was no longer entirely mud. "Why need to evacuate?" I said, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, too calm, too measured for what we were watching. "Immediate evacuation to the processing facility. Seal the blast doors. Vox for military support from the capital." Corvish looked at me with eyes that held a peculiar blankness, as if she'd retreated somewhere inside herself where reality couldn't quite reach. "We can't abandon the fields," she said. "The tithe. The fields are lost. The workers are dying. We need military intervention. The administratum doesn't authorize military deployment for localized security failures. We're required to resolve this with internal resources." I wanted to grab her, to shake her until that blank expression cracked and something human showed through. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do. I followed the chain of command. I prepared formal requisition documents for military assistance. I filed emergency reports through proper channels. I compiled casualty estimates and tactical assessments. And while I did this, while I performed my bureaucratic duties with the meticulous care that had earned me my position, the things that had been our dead spread through the cultivation zones, killing anyone who hadn't reached shelter quickly enough. By day 9, we'd lost approximately 400 workers. The survivors, roughly 1,300 souls, had retreated to the processing facility, a structure built to withstand storms and equipment failures, but not military assault. The facility was large enough to house everyone, barely, with people packed into storage areas and maintenance corridors, and any space that could be sealed against external access. We had food, grain stores sufficient for months if rationed properly. We had water from the facility's recycling systems. We had walls and doors and the desperate hope that the creatures outside would lose interest, would wander away, would somehow cease to be a problem that required solutions we didn't possess. The rain continued, grey and constant and thick enough to reduce visibility to almost nothing. Through the facility's external picked feeds, I watched it fall on fields where bodies lay in pieces, watched it pool in depressions that had been formed by the creature's passage. The water that pooled was wrong. It moved against the wind sometimes, formed shapes that suggested purposefulness rather than the random flow of liquid following gravity. I documented this in my reports because documenting was what I did, what gave structure to situations that otherwise felt like chaos. Zone Administrator Corvish stopped reviewing my reports on day 11. She'd taken to sitting in her office, staring at the wall, occasionally speaking to herself in a voice too low for me to hear the words. The creatures didn't leave. They remained in the cultivation zones, visible through the picked feeds as shapes moving through the rain, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually. They didn't seem to need shelter, didn't seem to rest. They just moved through our fields with a terrible patience, occasionally stopping to tear at something on the ground. Bodies, I assumed, though the rain made it difficult to see details. On day 13, I noticed that the fields themselves were changing. The grain we'd planted was dying, the stalks turning black and collapsing. But something else was growing in their place, organic structures that looked like fungal growths, thick and ropey, spreading in networks across the mud. They grew with visible speed, expanding meters per hour, and where they grew the ground developed a texture that reminded me of flesh, of skin stretched too tight over something beneath. The Vox channels had gone silent on day 10. No response from the capital, no acknowledgement of our emergency transmissions. Nothing but static and occasionally something else. Something that might have been voices, but weren't quite. Sounds that formed almost words in languages I didn't recognize. I tried different frequencies, different encryption protocols, everything I'd been trained to do in communication emergencies. Nothing worked. We were alone. 1,300 people trapped in a processing facility, surrounded by creatures that had been our dead, watching our world transform into something that bore no resemblance to what it had been. The children started showing symptoms on day 15. Fever first, then skin lesions that appeared without injury, then behavioral changes, aggression alternating with periods of catatonia, pupils dilating until the irises were barely visible. The facility's medical staff, 3 overworked individuals with basic training and limited supplies, did what they could, isolated the sick children in a sealed storage room, administered antibiotics and antipyretics, watched helplessly as the symptoms progressed despite treatment. By day 17, we had 43 children showing the syndrome. By day 19, the number had climbed to 71. And the parents of those children stood outside the sealed storage room, pressing their faces to the reinforced window, watching their sons and daughters convulse and scream and transform into something that was no longer entirely human. I need you to understand what that looked like. The transformation wasn't dramatic, wasn't the sudden eruption of claws and teeth that you see in propaganda films about xeno's threats. It was gradual, incremental, a slow restructuring of human biology into something optimized for purposes I couldn't begin to guess. The children's fingers lengthened, the bones visible beneath skin that had gone translucent and gray. Their spines curved in new ways, adding flexibility that looked wrong, that made them move with an articulation that human bodies shouldn't possess. Their faces remained recognizable. That was perhaps the worst part, that you could still see who they'd been even as what they were became something else. They stopped speaking on day 20. Started making sounds instead, clicking and hissing noises that formed patterns that sounded almost like communication, but in a language no human had ever spoken. The parents demanded we release the children, demanded we try different treatments, consult different medical resources, do something other than watch. I understood their desperation. I would have felt the same if my own children had been among the infected, but I also understood that releasing 71 transformed children into a population of 1,300 terrified people would result in immediate violence, would collapse the fragile order we'd maintained. I posted guards at the storage room, authorized them to use lethal force if the parents tried to breach the door, hated myself for giving that order, hated the necessity of it, hated the way some of the parents looked at me afterward. Not with anger, but with a hollow acceptance that suggested they'd already begun grieving, already started the process of letting go. Zone Administrator Corvish died on day 22. Suicide, technically, though I'm not certain she was fully conscious of what she was doing. I found her in her office, wrists opened with a grain knife, blood pooled around her chair in quantities that suggested she'd been there for hours. Her eyes were open, staring at something I couldn't see. I documented the death, filed the necessary reports to networks that no longer responded, and assumed her administrative duties, because someone had to maintain order, had to make the decisions that kept 1,300 people alive for whatever time remained. The transformed children broke out of the storage room on day 25, not through the door that remained sealed, its locking mechanisms intact. They broke through the floor. The processing facility had been built atop older structures, agricultural buildings from the planet's early settlement period that had been incorporated into the foundation. The children found access to those older spaces somehow, navigated through the dark, emerged in a maintenance corridor on the facility's eastern edge. The guards I'd posted at the storage room door didn't realize anything was wrong until the first screams started. By the time security responded, the children had killed 17 people and disappeared into the facility's ventilation systems, spaces too narrow for adults to follow. We hunted them for 3 days, small teams with portable lumens and what weapons we could improvise, shock, mauls, industrial cutting tools, anything that could be used to kill things that had been children. We found 5 of them. Killed them after brief, vicious fights in confined spaces where their new flexibility gave them terrible advantages. Lost 9 hunters in the process, the other 66 transformed children remained loose somewhere in the facility's infrastructure, moving through spaces we couldn't access, occasionally emerging to kill and feed and retreat before we could respond. People stopped sleeping in regular quarters, started gathering in large groups in open areas where they could watch all approaches. The facility developed internal borders, territories that different groups claimed and defended, cooperation breaking down into tribalism. I tried to maintain command. Issued orders through the Vox system, coordinated security patrols, managed food distribution. But authority requires consent, requires people believing that following your instructions increases their survival chances. As the deaths continued, as the facility became a hunting ground rather than a shelter, that consent eroded. By day 30, I had perhaps 300 people who still acknowledged my authority. The others had fragmented into smaller groups, led by whoever seemed strongest, whoever could promise protection in exchange for obedience. The processing facility, designed to hold at most 200 people comfortably, had become a collection of fortified positions occupied by terrified survivors who trusted no one outside their immediate group. The rain never stopped. I checked the picked feeds daily, watched the grey downpour continue without pause, watched the cultivation zones transform into landscapes I no longer recognized. The fungal growths had spread across everything, covered the fields in networks of organic matter that pulsed with visible rhythms, that seemed to breathe. The creatures. I'd stopped thinking of them as our dead, started calling them something else even in my own mind, had multiplied. The picked feeds showed dozens of them now, possibly hundreds, moving through the transformed landscape with purpose I couldn't interpret. And sometimes, when the rain lightened fractionally, I could see other things. Larger things, shapes that moved on 4 legs or 6 or more, organisms the size of buildings, their bodies composed of the same grey matter as the fungal growths, as if they'd been grown rather than born. On day 37, the facility's power failed. Not completely. The backup generators kicked in, maintained life support and minimal lighting. But we lost most of our systems. The picked feeds went dark. The Vox network collapsed to local, only communication. The temperature regulation stopped working, and the facility began taking on the ambient cold of the world outside. Cold that penetrated through walls that had been designed to insulate, but which were failing, developing cracks and gaps through which the rain began seeping. We tried to seal the breaches with materials scavenged from the facility's maintenance supplies, but there were too many, and they were growing, spreading like the cracks were alive and purposeful. The transformed children started coordinating their attacks. I don't know how they communicated. We never heard Vox, traffic, never found any equipment. But their actions showed planning, showed tactical awareness beyond what human children possessed. They'd strike at one group, draw away defenders, then hit a different group from an unexpected angle. They were learning from each encounter, adapting their strategies, becoming more efficient at killing the people they'd once lived among. By day 40, the facility's population had dropped to approximately 800. By day 45, we were down to 600. The mathematics were simple and terrible at current attrition rates. We'd all be dead before day 70. I stopped issuing orders on day 48. Not from despair, though despair was certainly present, a constant weight that made every action feel futile, but from practicality. No one was listening anymore. The facility had fragmented completely, become a warren of territories, held by groups ranging from 15 to 60 people, all of them willing to kill anyone who approached without proper identification. I'd become just another survivor, leading a group of 30. 7 people who occupied the administrative section, because it was familiar territory, because I knew its layout better than anyone. We fortified our position, posted guards, rationed food that was running lower every day, waited for an ending that felt inevitable. The walls breached on day 52. Not from the transformed children. They were still inside, still hunting, but they'd gone silent recently, stopped their attacks for reasons I couldn't determine. The breach came from outside, from the creatures that had been multiplying in the cultivation zones. They'd finally decided that the facility contained something they wanted, or perhaps they'd always known and had simply been waiting for us to weaken sufficiently. The eastern wall simply collapsed inward, the reinforced rockcrete crumbling like dried mud, and through the gap came things that had once been human, but which had been so extensively modified that only their basic bilateral symmetry remained recognizable. We fought, with everything we had, with improvised weapons and desperate courage, and the animal fury that comes from knowing you're already dead, but refusing to make it easy. My group held the administrative section for 4 hours, killed perhaps 20 of the creatures before we were overrun. I watched people I'd known for years torn apart in front of me, watched them die screaming or silent or fighting until the last second. I survived because I ran, because when our line collapsed I made the choice to abandon my position and flee deeper into the facility, rather than die defending territory that no longer mattered. 37 people under my command reduced to 17, then 8, then just me, running through corridors filled with bodies and blood and the smell of things that shouldn't exist. I found a hiding space in the facility's sub-basement, a maintenance access tunnel barely large enough for one person, sealed by a hatch that I could lock from inside. I crawled in with a lumen, pack and a canteen of water, and the understanding that this was where I would die, either from thirst or from whatever found me first. The hatch was solid steel, would take time for the creatures to breach if they discovered it, but time was all I had left anyway. That was 6 days ago, maybe 7. I've lost track. The lumen pack is dying, its light fading to a dim glow that barely illuminates the space around me. I can hear sounds through the hatch. Movement. The scrape of claws on metal. Occasionally something impacts the hatch from outside, testing it, and the steel flexes slightly but holds. I've been writing this testimony on paper I found in this maintenance space, using a stylus that barely functions, recording everything because recording is what I do, because if I stop documenting, then nothing I've witnessed matters. It's all just death without meaning. The rain is still falling. I can hear it through the facility's walls, a constant percussion that forms the baseline of everything else. Grey rain full of spores that transform worlds, that break down existing biology and rebuild it according to patterns that serve the Hive Fleet, that turn planets into feeding grounds and populations into raw material. We never stood a chance. The moment that first spore touched our atmosphere, the moment the rain began, we were already finished. Everything after that was just the slow process of consumption, of being broken down and restructured into something useful for entities we never saw, never understood, creatures so vast and alien that our extinction was just a minor task in their expansion across the galaxy. I think about the Emperor sometimes, about faith, about whether he sees what's happening here, whether he cares, whether our deaths serve some greater purpose. In the endless war humanity fights against the dark. The ecclesiarchy teaches that suffering strengthens faith, that through hardship we prove our devotion. But I feel no strength, no devotion, just exhaustion and the weight of all those deaths, all those people who trusted me to keep them safe, who died because I failed to understand what was happening quickly enough, failed to take actions that might have mattered when there was still time for action to matter. The transformed children are outside the hatch now. I can hear them clicking and hissing to each other, can hear the scrape of their elongated fingers on steel. They know I'm here. They've been circling this position for hours, patient in the way predators are patient when their prey is trapped. Eventually they'll breach the hatch, or I'll run out of water, or simple cellular breakdown will finish what the rain started. The ending is fixed. Only its timing remains uncertain. I write this for no one. The Vox networks are dead. The planet is dead. Everyone who might read these words is dead or dying. But I write anyway, because documentation is all I have left, because recording what happened here gives shape to the chaos, imposes structure on horror that otherwise exists beyond language. The Tyranids came to our world in rain that never stopped falling. They consumed us slowly, transformed us systematically, turned everything we'd built across 2 centuries into organic matter that serves their hunger. This is what happens when the spore-rain falls and doesn't stop. This is how worlds end, not in sudden violence, though violence comes, but in gradual transformation, in the slow realization that you're already dead, and just haven't stopped moving yet. The hatch is beginning to buckle. I can see it flexing with each impact, metal fatiguing, seal starting to fail. I'm setting down this testimony now, placing it in the waterproof case I found here, hoping, irrationally, that someone will eventually discover it, that some purpose exists beyond survival that makes any of this matter. My name was Thomas Vrel. I was Agri, Overseer 2nd Class of Cultivation Zone Epsilon 9. I maintained order as long as order was possible. I failed to save anyone. I die knowing that I was insignificant, that my world's death was insignificant. The Imperium will note our loss in some administrative log and move on, because that's what the Imperium does. It continues grinding forward regardless of how many are crushed beneath its wheels. The seal has failed. They're coming through. Grey light from outside spilling into my shelter, and with it the rain, still falling, always falling. I can see them now. Children I once knew, their faces still recognizable beneath the modifications, their eyes reflecting the dying lumen like an animal's eyes, like nothing human. I want to say I'll fight. Want to claim some dignity in the ending. But I'm tired. So tired, and fighting only delays what's already inevitable. The rain continues. The spores continue. The transformation continues. This is the truth they don't teach you in the ecclesiarchy schools, the truth the administratum buries in classified reports. Humanity is not special. We're just another biological substrate waiting to be repurposed by entities that cross the void between galaxies. The Emperor protects, they say. But the Emperor is not here. There's only the rain, grey and constant, falling on worlds that once held life, and which now hold only the Hive Fleet's appetite, endless and patient, and absolutely certain. I can feel my testimony ending with my life, feel the words running out along with time. If you're reading this, you already know how this story concludes. With death. With consumption. With the understanding that everything you build will eventually be broken down. Everything you are will be repurposed. Everything you believe will be proven irrelevant by the simple mathematics of predator and prey. The rain falls. The spores spread. The transformation continues, and we die, knowing that we were always going to die. That, from the moment we were born on worlds claimed by the Imperium, we were just resources waiting to be consumed by something hungrier than ourselves. They're here now. Their hands reaching for me. The testimony ends. The rain continues, always falling, never stopping. Grey rain on a grey world, transforming everything it touches, patient as extinction, certain as entropy. This is what happens when the spore-rain falls. This is how it ends, not with defiance or faith or hope, but with simple biological certainty. The strong consume the weak, the vast consume the small, and humanity, for all its pride, is neither strong nor vast, just temporarily unconsumed, waiting for the hunger that will eventually find us all. The Emperor protects, but the rain falls anyway, always falling, never stopping, and we all drown in it eventually, transformed into something useful for entities that will never know our names, will never care that we existed, will move on to the next world, and the next population, and the next transformation in an expansion that spans galaxies, and which will continue long after the last human has been consumed and repurposed and rendered into matter that serves the Hive Fleet's endless, patient, absolute hunger. The rain falls, I die. The testimony ends here.